So how Chinese used to sound, the challenges of an opaque writing system in the study of historical phonology. And just to give you an overview of the talk, first I will make a very brief methodological orientation. Then I will touch on Sumerian as a sort of comparandum, then look at Chinese. And when it comes to Chinese, discuss the nature of the script, phonetic information contained within the structure of the script, phonetic information from external sources, and that will be it. So turning to the method, there's this sort of theory of social science methodology from Karl Marx to ascend from the abstract to the concrete. And I think that's kind of the organizational principle I'm going to be using here tonight. The role of Sumerian is to provide me with some of the necessary abstractions and then apply these to Chinese. So I should emphasize that I really know nothing at all about Sumerian, zero, which I see as a decided advantage. So so Sumerian begins the 31st century BCE, very long time ago. But the older the texts are, the more morphemes are omitted in the writing. And Sumerian has, let's say, is typologically exciting. Yeah, it has lots of prefixes and suffixes and agreement and all sorts of exciting stuff going on, of the type that that we have in a lot of Sino-Tibetan languages, like Kiranti languages and Gauronic languages, but generally the kind of stuff we don't think of Chinese as having. But it's only in the early second millennium, when Sumerian was probably already extinct and only spoken in schools, that all of the affixes are fully expressed. Which is to say, if you look at the early Sumerian, when Sumerian was a robust living language, from the point of view of an investigator today, it might well look like a highly isolating language with very little morphology. And that's just because the Sumerians didn't feel the need to write it down, because they all knew it. Whereas, in particular, in this bilingual context of Akkadians having to learn Sumerian as a second language, they felt the need to spell everything out. So I think that's a useful story to keep in mind, which means that apparently isolating graphic information does not necessarily say anything about what the morphological profile of the language was. So let's look at some Sumerian concretely. This is the sign for the word sag, which means head. And then later it was written like this. So you can see that it goes from more iconic to more abstract, partly just for reasons of the convenience of writing. And then here is the sign for mouth. So you see it's like the sign for head, but with some indication that you should pay attention to this particular part. And then that also gets stylized in a way that has a certain graphic relationship to the stylized version of head. But no phonetic relationship, right? Okay, so now you can make phono-semantic compound graphs where you have some indication of the sound and some indication of the meaning. So here, I'm giving the example that you see at the bottom of the slide of eme, which means tongue. So this sign is formed by putting me, which means 100. It doesn't have anything to do with tongue semantically, but has a certain phonetic similarity. You put that inside the sign for mouth, and that's how you form the sign me, which means tongue. Okay. Now just another example of these phono-semantic compound graphs. So we start again with ka, but this time we put nun inside of it. We then get lip, nundum. We get the sign for lip. So lip has something semantically to do with mouth and something phonetically to do with nun. So that's how we make this sign nundum. Yeah. So now let's look at how you actually write a word. I'm going to look at raven and fish. So you find yourself wanting to write the word for raven, which was pronounced uga. And I guess, I mean, this seems a little bit far-fetched to me, but it's what the secondary literature says. So there you go. You say, well, what's the most similar sounding sign I already know of? And apparently it's naga, but clearly naga and uga don't really sound that similar. So I look for a sign u, and I look for a sign ga, and I put the u in front of naga and the ga afterwards. And then I get this structure of I guess the way to understand it is this sign naga that you know, but you also know has the reading uga. Well, in this context, read it uga because I put an u in front of it and a ga after it. So it's quite redundant in terms of information. Yeah, you could just use the u, and you could just use the ga, and then say uga like a syllabary. But it's more redundant than that. For historical reasons. And I should say, of course, there's a lot of spelling variation. This is just one way of writing words that are pronounced uga. And then if you want to distinguish raven from fish, you can put this sign mushen, which means bird, at the end of this uga, or you can put the kud, which means fish, at the end of the uga. And I think anyone who knows Japanese will also recognize that the purpose of these semantic determiners, that's what we would call them in Chinese, is not simply to give an indication of the meaning, but also of morpheme boundaries. So that as you're reading, rather than just seeing a string of meaningless syllables, you see, okay, I should bunch these signs together and try and read them as a morpheme. I should bunch these signs together and try and read them as a morpheme. Let's now develop some abstractions about how Sumerian works. So a particular grapheme is associated with at least, because it usually, often will be more than one, but at least one semantic value and one phonetic value. So using a notation that William Boltz puts forward, that's quite straightforward, you can think of the sign as kind of plus S and plus P. So if you ignore the semantics of a particular grapheme, we'll call it G1, it can be added to another grapheme, we'll call it G2, to disambiguate the pronunciation of the latter. So we have a sign with both, let's say with more than one, but at least one, P and S, and we're adding another sign to it that we're ignoring the semantics of in order to disambiguate the second sign. So the sign that's being added, we've sort of turned off the S, but we're leaving the P, okay? This we can call the rebus principle. And then on the other hand, if we ignore the phonetics of grapheme G1, we can add it to a grapheme G2 to disambiguate the meaning. So that's what we've seen in the raven versus fish example. And here we can say we've sort of turned off the P and we've left the S. And we call this second one semantic extension. Now I call it semantic extension because the meaning is always a change of meaning. You might be using the first process, the rebus principle, from going from one pronunciation to exactly the same pronunciation in a different morpheme. But the semantic determiners always will be associated with a change in meaning because two different morphemes in a language mean two different things by definition. Yeah? So that's a semantic extension. So I think that's a nice abstract characterization of what's going on in Sumerian. So now just some observations about Sumerian. The development of the writing system took a very long time. Complex graphemes are not spatially equivalent to simplex graphemes. Now, this may seem like a strange observation to someone who works in cuneiform studies, but it's important. It's one of the most striking things as a sinologist, and I'll even back up and just look at it. You know, this uga, meaning fish, is a different size than just one sign. Whereas in Chinese, when we make compound signs, we make everything small so that the size of a sign stays always the same size. Yeah. Another way of putting the same observation is that there's no notion of a character in the Chinese sense. Another thing that I think is intriguing is that there's no strict standard of phonetic similarity underpinning the application of the rebus principle. If we just look at the cases that I've discussed, you have me serving as the phonetic for ene, where if you want to have an abstract principle, it would be something like the application of this phonetic in a new environment means that the second morpheme ends with the same CV as the one we're using to indicate it. And then there's this nun used for nundum, which instead the principle would be starts with the same CVC. And then using naga for uga, I find a little particularly strange because it's some kind of principle like ends with the same CV and has some vowel before that CV, but not necessarily the same vowel. It looks to me like the Sumerians did not have a phonological theory underpinning their application of the rebus principle. Not that you would expect them to. This lack of consistency in principles is made up for with redundancy. Because, you know, if I found myself thinking, how does this possibly work in practice? And then I think, well, it's because there's a lot of inbuilt redundancy. You say, you know, uga, ga, then you've made sure that although there are many dimensions of possible confusion on the part of the reader, with the correct training, in a given circumstance, they will always know how to read it. The other thing I've asked myself is how on earth did people, you know, after the death of this language, thousands of years later, figure out any of this? And I don't know, but I assume it's because we have basically the whole school curriculum of kind of classical Sumerian learning preserved, so that, you know, in a sense, well, if kids could do it, 3,000 years ago, then scholars can do it today, despite the fact that there are so few kind of rigorous principles underlying the script's organization. So Chinese emerges into history with a fully developed writing system in 1250 BCE, so way, way after Sumerian. And complex graphs are spatially equivalent to simplex graphs. So now we're going to apply our abstractions to the analysis of Chinese. You start with an iconic grapheme. In this case, it looks like a field. It's how you lay out a field. So it's a picture of a field, and it means field, and it's pronounced ling. And then you can apply semantic extension to it. This is to the same character, right? Reading it rui, later with a different writing. The meaning is like a burr. It's like this kind of raised piece of earth between two fields. And you can also use the rebus principle. So say, okay, I'm going to use it for another word pronounced ling, here hunt. It's also later written with a different character. Okay, now just to go through two more examples. You can draw a picture of fire to mean fire. Then you can use that same character, semantically extend it to refer to this word conflagration that has a different pronunciation. You can also take a picture of a nose that's pronounced bits, and using the rebus principle, you can use it for this word sbits, which means self. But now let's look at the phonetic information inside the script. So there are these things we call a xiésheng series, which are different characters that are built using the same phonetic determiner. And we're going to look at this one, bie, where the pronunciations are coming now from Middle Chinese. So they're attested pronunciations from many centuries later. Yeah. And you see, okay, you have bie, bie in a different tone. The capital X refers to a tone. And then you have pie and you have pie. So looking at evidence like this, you can come up with what we call the xiésheng hypothesis. So Li Fenghui is not the first version of the xiésheng hypothesis, but we'll say it's the one that is most used nowadays, proposes that characters with the same phonetic component share the same rhyme and have a initial that is homoorganic with each other. So we saw this with the examples that I gave. They have the same rhyme, but you can allow interchange between a B, a P, and an aspirated P. So this hypothesis is the cornerstone of all progress, I would dare say, in Chinese historical phonology. And let's say one way of summing up my observations on Sumerian, or at least some of them, is there is nothing like the xiésheng hypothesis, it seems, in the study of Sumerian. So here's some examples. We see that we have two characters that have the same rhyme, have the same phonetic, but one begins with a nga and one begins with a ha. So we want to sort of fix it, you know, make it so that in Old Chinese, these are Middle Chinese readings, in Old Chinese, they would have had homoorganic initials. So the proposal that I think most people believe is that you had voiceless resonants. So in this case, your voiceless velar nasal changes to a voiceless velar fricative. And then in a similar case, just to show you that it works in other cases too, we do the same thing for a labial. So we have characters that have the same rhyme, or characters which in Middle Chinese readings have the same rhyme, but in their Middle Chinese readings, one starts with an N and one again starts with a voiceless velar fricative. So we propose, maybe there were voiceless labial resonants, and those change, maybe with some conditioning environment that I'm not going to get into here, into voiceless velar fricatives. Okay, so now you see an example of the xiésheng principle in action. How we use this assumption, although well-founded assumption, to let's say internally reconstruct Middle Chinese to fit the xiésheng hypothesis. So there's a guy, Shushan, who in the very early Han Dynasty wrote a book called the Shouwenjiezi, where he says, among other things, he says of about 9,000 Chinese characters, what the phonetics are and what the semantics are. But he classified Chinese characters into 6 types, and only one of them is this phono-semantic compound type. We will not worry about most of the types. What we do want to look at is the Hui-yi type. So this, according to him, is when you take two characters and you combine them without reference to their sound at all, but only from their meaning. And here are some examples. And one reason I've decided to talk about this is these examples are like oftentimes when someone is first told about the Chinese script, these are examples that they're presented with. So, woman plus child equals good. And woman plus roof equals peace, because, having your wife at home, it makes you feel so peaceful. Yeah. And the sun and the moon together are bright, because, the sun's bright and the moons are bright. So somehow the sun and the moon together are bright. So these are kind of just so stories that suggest, the Chinese wrote ideas, and then they combined their ideas to create new ideas, writing the ideas directly with graphemes rather than via the mediation of language. So you can probably guess that I have a certain skepticism about this. Let's look at Sumerian. Does Sumerian have hui characters. I don't know what the Sumerianists say. They probably don't call them hui characters in any case. But here is one example I have seen discussed in the secondary literature, which is sag plus ninda, so head plus bread, can be read gu, which means eat. And I just want to point out that it is not necessary to look at this picture and analyze it as sog plus ninda. You can just say it's a person putting bread in their mouth. The iconic relationship is still there, and it becomes a philological question. You know, maybe this character is attested before ninda as bread. Maybe ninda as a grapheme was actually extracted from this character, right? There's nothing a priori that tells you that, you know, the relationship between iconic things, if the iconicity is still active. In any case, moving on to Chinese, I would say the same thing about this example of woman plus child equals good. In oracle bone inscriptions, the character exists and it's still iconic. Let's say it's a child sitting on a woman's lap. That's not an uncontroversial interpretation, but it's iconic. That's the point I'm making. It's not necessary, because it's iconic already, to see it as a combination of the words woman and child. William Boltz, who I'm following for most of this, believes there are no hui characters, and that the reason that xiésheng thought there were was because of changes, both sound changes and meaning changes and paleographic changes between the origin of the script and the early Han Dynasty. So let's look at some of these hui characters. Okay, peace. Peace is a woman under a roof. Well, not necessarily, because in fact there are two xiésheng series that use this phonetic. One with na-like readings and one with on-like readings. So it's perfectly fine to say just that the semantic in peace is roof and the phonetic is woman. To give another example, we have this picture of the moon. So it means moon, yeah? And there's one series built on it in the meaning moon, where it's read nuat, and you can see the series there. And there's one series built on it in the meaning night, where it was pronounced something like zgak. So that part everyone agrees with. But now let's move to a third one. Boltz would say there's a third reading of this character in the meaning like bright, where there's a series that bright itself is built from, and that the character for name is built from. So bright would have been pronounced merang, and if you look at it, it's not the sun that the moon is next to. It's the word for window. In Bertrand Segar's reconstruction, the word for window was pronounced something like kumrang. So you can actually see it exactly like in the Sumerian case that we, where, you know, this picture moon had three readings. So we're applying either further phonetic specifiers or further semantic specifiers to say which of those three readings are intended. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the hui hypothesis. But basically, the lesson I want you to go away with is, if anyone ever says, "Oh, you know, in Chinese, child plus woman is good, and woman plus roof is peaceful," that's nonsense. Woman plus child is good is not xiésheng's example. That was a little bit of sleight of hand. Xiésheng only, I think he gives something like only 7 hui, and I thought about presenting those, but they were less sort of obvious, so I didn't. Which is to say, the stupid hui examples should not be credited to xiésheng. They've come up, you know, later. So now just a A few words about phonetic sources, external phonetic sources. We have loans from Chinese into other languages and loans into Chinese, and then some explicit comments, philological comments about pronunciation. So loans from Chinese into other languages. Chinese has this word for 10,000, which in Middle Chinese is something like man. And Baxter and Cigar actually in 2014 reconstructed, for reasons that I'm not going to go into, with an unspecified consonant prefix. But if you look at Old Turkic and Tocharian, which are words that were in contact with Chinese at the right time, they both point to a T prefix. And this T prefix also helps explain the occurrence of this word scorpion that has a T initial in Middle Chinese in the same xiésheng series. So here's an example where Baxter and Cigar didn't know, was it a T prefix or a P prefix or a K prefix? And then the borrowing of this Chinese word into other languages shows us it must have been a T prefix. Moving on, Indo-Aryan loans into Old Chinese. So I think that the word for horse in Old Chinese was something like rma, and that it comes from arwant in Indo-Aryan. And this is based on work that's still unpublished with Hannes Fellner and Dieter Gunkel. Maybe a less controversial example is the word chariot, which is borrowed from the Indo-Aryan word for wheel. And archaeological evidence, I think, is totally unambiguous that Indo-Aryan speakers introduced the horse and chariot to China around 1250 BC, which incidentally is also when the Chinese invented their writing system. Although that's, that's surely a coincidence, right? Okay, now explicit comments on pronunciation. So I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but you have comments like this one, where in the 7th century, someone says how to pronounce transliterations from Sanskrit into Chinese. He says that those characters used to transliterate short vowels in Sanskrit should all be read in the rising tone. So this is something that Mei Tzu-lin points to as evidence that there was a glottal stop final in the rising tone, which would correlate with short vowels. And then here's a discussion from the Shouwen about dialect differences. So they say, okay, there's this word brush, and in Chu it's called mrut, and in Wu it's called prut, and in Yan it's called put, and in Chin it's called prut. So this is good evidence for figuring out how Old Chinese was pronounced. Explicit discussion of dialect variation. And here's another example where I will sort of skip over the details, but basically a guy travels to a certain area and they pronounce a word that he pronounces as lip. They pronounce it like pick. So this is maybe good evidence for a consonant cluster, something like prick in Old Chinese. And then last but not least, in these kind of explicit philological discussions, one of the best, I think, examples of dialect variation in Old Chinese discussed by Baxter and Cigar is that R changes to N in the West and R changes to Ya in the East. And here's an example. Nowadays, the people of Yanzhou all pronounce the family name Yin as Yi, so they pronounce as Ai. And transcriptions of loan words, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I'll just point out these are Middle Chinese, Han Chinese, Sanskrit, and you see that you get in Middle Chinese capital H's where you have an S in Sanskrit, and that's quite good evidence, I think, that these were actually pronounced as S's at this point. Yeah. And then, I don't know, just a fun case, Alexandria. So if you say this in, even in Middle Chinese, you get Uyik Srenle. It's not a great transcription of Alexandria. But in Old Chinese, it's Alek Sran Rai. Okay, there are still some details that are confusing to me, like where did the D go? But, I think it's pretty good evidence that, for instance, this Ya comes from La and was still La in 36 BC. Okay, and then the very last thing I will talk about is rhyme patterns, where if you look at old poetry, and this is an ode, and you read it in modern Chinese, you can tell it should rhyme because you get things like duo and luo rhyming in the second stanza, and you get things like jie and xie rhyming in the third stanza. But in the first stanza, it sure doesn't seem like cai and yo rhyme. So these kinds of things are invitations to make proposals that fix the rhyme scheme. And I'm going to just give one example, although it's not from that poem, which is there's this idea that the vowel a as opposed to a in Middle Chinese comes from ra in Old Chinese. And if you look at some rhymes, you get mak, huak, and hiak rhyming. So if you change the hiak into the krak, hiak into krak to krak rather, it would rhyme better. And then similarly, in another ode, you get kang, huang, quang, xiang. So if this quang changed into quang or kruang, then it would rhyme better. So that's just an example of one of the motivations we have either for coming up with hypotheses or for testing hypotheses about how Old Chinese was pronounced. Even though Chinese really doesn't give you much information about how it was pronounced, the methods are the same as you would use in figuring out how Latin was pronounced or how Greek was pronounced, which is you look at loan words in and out of the language, you look at the inherent structure of the script, you look at philological comments like explicit, meta discursive things. You look at poetic devices that give you information about phonetics. The tone we mark with capital H in Baxter's transcription of Middle Chinese comes from an S, and I can point to evidence like Sanskrit for that. And then the tone that Baxter marks with an X, it comes from a glottal stop. I think the evidence for that is much less convincing. Actually, the fact that this one comment that I pointed to of use this tone when pronouncing transcriptions of Sanskrit short vowels is considered one of the best pieces of evidence. But otherwise, it's dialect pronunciations, particularly in southern China, where it's still articulated with a final glottal stop. One thing to mention is that Middle Chinese has 4 tones. So I just told you about 2 of them. One of them we don't need to talk about because you can think of it as the unmarked tone. And then the 4th one is stop finals. So in let's say in Chinese internal analysis, a syllable like pang and a syllable like pak are the same, but in different tones. So in the West, we would tend to say, no, they're not the same. One ends with a nasal and one ends with a stop. But already, in, let's say, 602, when we get an explicit analysis of these things, the Chinese phonological tradition treated those as the same modulo differences of tone. And at that time, there were 4 tones. There are Chinese dialects with way more than 4 tones. Those are secondary splits because of things like manner onset. This gets into sort of articulatory phonetics that it's not really my area. But for instance, like if you look at the first formant of a syllable pronounced with a voiced onset, and the same syllable pronounced with a voiceless onset, the formant of the syllable pronounced with the voice onset will be lower. That's just a sort of fact of human biology, right? So bak is going to have a lower first formant than pak. So the theory is, and this of course is, I'm giving a general presentation, not actually what happened in Old Chinese to Middle Chinese, is that speakers rephonologize the contrast from one of manner onset to one of pitch. So then, let's say in Old Chinese, something similar, which is that glottal stops tend to correlate with a decline in pitch, and S's tend to correlate with a rise in pitch. And what makes people do that? I don't know. The probability space is constrained by human biology and human reason, if you like. But when and where these changes actually take place is I don't know, is just what history is. I reassure you that it is real. So let's take it this way. We start in 602. That's when we had Middle Chinese, and let's say as an abstraction, as a kind of point of analysis, we can pretend that at that moment, although this is of course not true, there was no dialect variation. And then, woo, you get dialect variation spreading out. By the Tang Dynasty, you had this Northwest Middle Chinese, which has some very clear features associated with it. Like final T has changed into final R, and nasal initials have become pre-nasalized stops. So just to give one example, a syllable like nat would have changed into ndar, yeah? And you can tell that, like, you know, there's loads of evidence. Transcriptions in and out of Tibetan, in and out of Uyghur, just there's loads of evidence. I think in and out of Tongut. And it's also clear that at a certain point, that dialect stopped being spoken, got sort of engulfed in the mass of other Chinese dialects around it. Zhongwei Shen has written about this in his new book from Cambridge University Press. And there are some features of Old Northwest that have been sort of, let's say, I don't quite like this way of talking, but that surface as a substrate influence on the varieties of standard Mandarin spoken in Northwest China, but Old Northwest Chinese has sadly disappeared. Well, I'll just talk about one example. It's three women. In that case, Boltz says, let's say that at a minimum, one of those women is the phonetic and one of them is a semantic, yeah? And I think that, let's say, and some people have said that's absurd, right? People look at it and they see three women. But then I would say, you know, there's two questions that need to be sort of taken separately. One is our attempt to model the psychology of pre-modern people, and the other one is the correct methodology for doing our own research. And I think it's a reasonable hypothesis to suggest that at the margin, people preferred to have writings that were not wildly uneconomical in terms of their sort of phonological analysis, which is to say, you know, look, if you can analyze woman as a phonetic radical in that situation, why not? Now, then if you push that sort of methodology too far, then you come up with sort of absurd questions like, well, which woman is the phonetic and which one is the semantic, right? Which clearly, at that point, you need to sort of take the perspective of the internal psychology of the pre-modern people and say, like, well, that kind of question wouldn't arise.